On April 21st, 1945, two German aircraft were loaded with precious cargo and hauled to a runway just miles from the encroaching Soviet army. Things were already going disastrously for the Nazis, but this scene underlined their desperation. The planes had to be pulled to the runway by oxen, as fuel was too scarce to waste, even on a mission like this. This assignment was supposed to be straightforward. Take a few people and a few select boxes from the underground bunker that Adolf Hitler, Eva Braun, and their closest associates had retreated to in the final days of the war. Most every other artifact that had been stored there, documents, maps, telegrams, directives, were even then being incinerated in an open-air pit just outside the bunker entrance. The only papers that remained had been boxed up by an underling named Julius Schaub and placed in the care of experienced pilot Friedrich Anton Gundelfinger. Per Mark Felton's book, Hitler's Lost Secret Documents, quote, "The fact that whatever was inside those 10 zinc boxes was not consigned to a bonfire by Schaub or Hitler's orders indicates that they were to be saved as part of Hitler's legacy." The boxes would not reach their Bavarian destination. The plane they were on, piloted by Gundelfinger, was shot out of the sky, exploding on earthly impact. Hitler was informed soon after about the loss of the aircraft and everything and everyone aboard. Those zinc boxes would, strangely enough, loom large in the years to come. If recovered, they might have reshaped how Hitler's legacy was interpreted. But remaining loss may have also changed the future, helping to usher in the dawn of one of the next century's greatest catastrophes. That is, the one where journalism lost its credibility and fake news was given free rein to saturate the media environment, where truth is so devalued that it's now what anyone says it is. This is Crimes of the Centuries, and I'm Amber Hunt. On Friday, April 22nd, 1983, the world learned that 62 secret diaries kept by Adolf Hitler had been discovered and verified as authentic, and they were about to be revealed to a world that was anxious, still, to know that man's every thought. No, check that. They wanted to know his every reason for doing what he had done. Seek world domination and global subjugation while attempting to wipe out an entire faith with a soulless barbarism rarely seen in human history. Robert Harris, a BBC reporter and the author of Selling Hitler, said the excitement about the find was extraordinary. It was a big deal when the world heard he might have kept a diary. It was potentially sensational. People wanted to learn something about this man that they hadn't been exposed to before. To add to the dramatic reveal, the much-read and well-respected West German news and photo weekly magazine Stern told its readers that the diaries were found along with a treasure trove of other materials that belonged to the dictator. The trove consisted of some 300 watercolors Hitler had painted and an assortment of letters he had written to Eva, as well as his Nazi Party membership card and the helmet and uniform he had proudly worn during the First World War. All of it had been salvaged from the wreckage of Gundelfinger's doomed aircraft almost 38 years before, the one that crashed just days before Hitler's death and quietly stashed away for decades. Over the years, these priceless relics had been hidden, sold off piece by piece, and finally reunited for the world to see. The finds were, in the 1970s and 80s, apparently far enough removed from the horrors of that war that interest in the Nazis, and in Hitler in particular, wasn't viewed as unseemly. In fact, explains the BBC's Harris, in the 1970s there was a Hitler wave. They called it the Hitler Welle. Harris said there were a lot of documentaries and biographies about Hitler. It was a real awakening, he called it. The interest in the man was so great that by 1980, it said that there were 2 times as many biographies of Hitler than of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and 3 times as many as of President Franklin Roosevelt, which could be considered heartening, really, that people were looking backward to search for a way to avoid the mistakes of the past. It was also something that, in some instances, morphed into the dangerous for those who wished to emulate the Nazis. Of course, there was always that tedious middle ground when the interest in Hitler became a creepy obsession with seemingly average citizens who wanted to own a piece of Hitlerana, his clothing, his paintings, his writings, his random doodads. That latter market was thriving now, especially in Europe, especially among those who, quietly, had never quite stopped admiring the man or his ideas. Of course, these never-before-seen diaries were not in the category of more doodads. They were so valuable as to be priceless, and so important that Stern had spent more than 18 months in negotiations and shelled out millions of Deutschmarks for the exclusive publishing rights. Now, pre-Diaries, Hitlerana was an odd market, one that was awash in fakes. Most finds, random whatnots and widgets, were found in East Germany or Soviet Russia, passed down with some story or pretend provenance that amateur collectors accepted at face value. So prevalent was the forgery market that, even today, experts estimate that there are so many fake Hitler paintings out there that no one knows what a real Hitler painting even looks like. According to the New York Times' Christine Schutze, writing in 2019 when German authorities began to seriously question auction house sales of Hitler's alleged artwork, quote, Hitler did most of his painting before the First World War, after he was rejected from art school and before he volunteered for the German army. Once in power, he ordered the works collected, and he may have destroyed some of the more embarrassingly bad ones, end quote. In any case, even the casually interested took note when Stern announced that it would be publishing excerpts from these newly found and outright sensational private diaries of the Fuhrer that the magazine said had been verified by forensics and scholars as authentic. Now, that does not mean that other Hitler experts out there weren't already skeptical. Even before the first Stern installment dropped, newspapers were queuing up the serious doubters who had a lot of scholarly reason to believe the diaries were frauds. There was the seeming lack of evidence that Hitler wrote much, and there was and is no historical artifact that mentions him journaling or privately revealing his thoughts in a daily diary. Next, skeptics noted, Hitler's handwriting had been distinctive. It was spidery, tight, and tended to fall off downward to the right as he approached the end of a line or when he signed his name. He also had always written using a Gothic version of the German language that, by the 1980s, few people could even read. According to American handwriting expert and autograph dealer Charles Hamilton, who was shown samples of the diaries by a Newsweek reporter before Stern published them, quote, when Hitler did write, he always crowded his words. On the packages I saw, the words were much too far apart, and the lines did not collapse at the end in Hitler's characteristic downward slant. The writing lacked the tumultuous force of Hitler's pen. The handwriting was halting and indecisive because the document was drawn the way an artist would draw a picture, end quote. But Hamilton didn't go unchallenged. Others saw the writing as reflective of Hitler's personal deterioration as the war slogged on. Hamilton found that to be too easy an explanation. By the end of the war, he said, Hitler's Parkinson's disease was so advanced he could barely lift his arm, much less a pencil, to write long, reflective journal entries. Lastly, to those who questioned the diary's authenticity early on, what little of the text that had been leaked showed Hitler to be, well, a somewhat likable dude. British historian Norman Stone, one reviewer of the materials, even likened the diary's author to a, quote, Charlie Chaplin version of Hitler, end quote. For example, this Hitler praised English Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain as a smoothie and Joseph Stalin as doing the right thing by gutting the Soviet officer corps. Odd praise, considering it nearly left the Soviets defenseless when Germany invaded. The diaries also included uncommon expressions of emotion that Hitler was hardly famous for. He wrote about having great empathy for Eva, who, in 1941, may have suffered a miscarriage or a false pregnancy. This Hitler tisked about how Joseph Goebbels, his chief propagandist, was harassing too many women they both worked with, and he was going to put a stop to that nonsense. A man ahead of his time. So, #MeToo. This Hitler even suggested that he deliberately allowed more than 330,000 Allied troops to escape at Dunkirk, just to engender some goodwill should he ever want to negotiate peace with the English. And there was more. The diaries, for instance, had Hitler considering the relocation of European Jews to some vague resettlement camp in Russia. Just as a reminder, he wouldn't have been proposing to relocate the population of some small town. He was talking about nearly 10 million people. But still, compared to what he actually did, this sounded softer. Now, expert Hamilton found such musings implausible. In his book, The Hitler Diaries, Hamilton wrote, quote, "There is in the diaries absolutely no evidence that he knew about the gas chambers, the crematories, the death camps, the shooting down of women and children, the mass graves with many victims being alive. We are led to believe that the Hitler of the diaries would never sanction such murderous conduct toward the Jews. In fact, in his mention of Kristallnacht, when mobs of Germans broke thousands of windows of Jewish stores, burned or destroyed 177 synagogues, and left the streets covered with broken glass, the Nazi dictator is apparently unaware of the extensive destruction and atrocities. He bemoans only the broken glass." End quote. Skeptics found it all too ridiculous, and they suspected they knew exactly why the diaries took this tone and why that version of Hitler might prove appealing. According to the BBC's Harris, these diaries painted a Hitler who was a lonely guy just trying to do his best. They showed him as being against the attack on Jewish property in 1938. He thought it had gone too far. Harris said the diaries were a kind of rehabilitation for Hitler. This guy wasn't a monster. He was, as Harris put it, a man they could feel comfortable about venerating. And yet, the diaries spewed plenty of Hitler-esque venom. New York Post reporter Guy Houghton summarized a particularly disturbing entry he had read in the diaries. Quote, "In a hate-filled passage, Hitler raves on about how the Jews expect to be fed and clothed by the Reich while remaining its enemies. He says that they cannot be settled within the borders of the Reich and the occupied territory, and that nobody will take them. Because of this entry reads, the Jews should be loaded into ships, sent out to sea, and sunk." End quote. Yeah, not exactly misunderstood guy with a heart of gold material. So, what to believe? Were the diaries authentic, a genuine historical revelation, or something else altogether? It was a hard call because by the time Stern was ready to unleash the diaries onto the public, other major outlets had already bought in. Paris Match, Newsweek, Rupert Murdoch's Sunday Times, and the Times of London had all bought into the big history-remaking reveal. The story would either be the journalistic coup of the century or a spectacular humiliation. Let's go back to East Germany, circa 1970. It's here that a small-time thief and petty thug named Konrad Kujau had been visiting his family in Lürbau in East Germany when he saw an opportunity he could not resist. Now living in West Germany, Kujau had told himself he was going to get on the right side of the law, but this was a goldmine waiting for him. While in Lürbau, Kujau began picking up Third Reich relics for next to nothing, then flipping them in the West for a tidy profit. He could do this for a few reasons. First, the Soviet-controlled East had outlawed possession of Nazi memorabilia, making it cheap and easy to acquire. Second, the West German Deutschmark was worth about 5 times more than East Germany's currency. And third, demand in the West for Nazi helmets, steins, badges, uniforms, medals, the whatnots and their widgets, was practically insatiable. Kujau, a liar who loved his lies, also loved the art and pageantry of the Khan. He began his new secret import business as a small enterprise. It's likely that, on the West German side of things, his only accomplice was his common-law wife, Edith Lieblang. To his buyers, he would pretend to be a Nazi expert, having written, he said, a dozen books on the topic of Hitler and his art. He'd dress up in SS uniforms to show off his Nazi wares. He'd carry banned Nazi pistols as a sideshow. Strangely, it worked. The demand seemed never to let up. So he enlisted his family's help in Lübau, having them place local ads to solicit folks to sell him their war contraband, and he increased his trips back home, shipping it all back in ever more numerous crates. It was tricky business. He had to pass customs, after all, and he had to repeatedly hedge what the crates contained. He reportedly greased a few palms to make it all smooth sailing. Kujau was a crook, of course, but he was also a quick study. He learned that stories sold stuff, so the better the tale that accompanied the relic, the higher the price it could command. And the stories, while fanciful, had to be believable, so he learned to manufacture documents that pinned down the realism. An example, he acquired a helmet that dated from World War I. He then scratched the initials AH in the neck guard and wrote a little note that read, "This is the helmet I wore in my first action at Ypres on October 28th through 31st, 1914, when my right coat sleeve was ripped off by an enemy bullet. A fragment of shrapnel ricocheted off the top of this helmet and it may have saved my life. It should be kept. Adolf Hitler." Holy smokes, the would-be buyer would think. The great man might not have lived to try to conquer the world if this steel dome hadn't taken a hit for him. Who wouldn't pay through the nose for that hunk of heroic helmet? But Kujau wasn't greedy. Not exactly. He knew not to oversell, keeping such bon mots in check as to not alert the overly circumspect. Likeable? Yeah. A choir boy? Not so much. Harris described him as a sort of roly-poly figure. He said he was exuberant and boisterous and the kind of guy who'd slap you on the back. He was everybody's friend in the bar. But he also was a troublemaker, especially when it came to the law. Harris said, quote, "He was quite ready to have a fight. He was a rogue, really, is the best way to describe him. He was absolutely a congenital liar. He would tell lies as easily as he would breathe. He had a lot of aliases. He was an altogether curious character," end quote. A fair artist himself, he was probably far better than Hitler. He also took to sketching a few things that were in Hitler's limited artistic style, signing them rather offhandedly as AH, and including them as throw-ins with big-ticket items. So a buyer might pay for a high-priced pistol and get a gratis landscape of, say, a battle scene where the Fuhrer was known to have served. Still, he was no piker. The Hitler scrawl, he once told authorities, had taken him 2 years to perfect. His forgeries, as Hamilton would note in his book, reveal a rather ingenious and well-rounded copyist. He made party membership cards, put wax seals on documents to give them oomph, forged multiple names on things to shore up the authenticity guarantees he'd crafted in his shop. He provided authentication papers with everything, from clothes worn on known occasions to flags flown over known battlefields. He drew a variety of swastikas on scrap paper, suggesting that Hitler had tested out designs before settling on which to use. He took ribbons off real but lesser documents and put them on the forge works to give them the panache they deserved. Business was brisk. He was gaining a name not only among casual collectors, but also within more serious corners of the memorabilia world. As the 70s progressed, Kujau was also emboldened by his success, straight up inventing documents that had no grounding in known history. He even began to imagine that Hitler would have penned a few poems. It all found a buyer. Kujau would, much later, show no remorse. Of an awful rhyming ditty he wrote entitled Der Kamerad, he admitted, quote, a 14-year-old collector would have recognized it as a forgery, end quote. That said, he was so impressed by his little operation that he gave serious thought to having Hitler compose an opera because Hitler had loved opera and, why not? Problem was, it dawned on him one day he would have to learn how to read music first, and that was asking a bit much. But Kujau's mind never stopped spinning. Historically, it's unclear exactly when the idea came to him to start producing a few diary pages for limited consumption, but the notion took hold at some point in the 70s, and it was a good one. Especially since one of Kujau's favorite customers was wealthy Stuttgart collector Fritz Stiefel. And Stiefel personally knew people who had survived the war and had very legitimate connections with Hitler, such as General Hans Bauer, who had been Hitler's pilot, and SS General Karl Wolff, an aide to Holocaust idea man Heinrich Himmler. Stiefel was the first to acquire a page from what Kujau framed as part of a mysterious cache of Hitler's personal diaries. Stiefel could keep a secret, but he also liked to show off. He had amassed voluminous Nazi bounty, acquired through the hard work of Kujau, a man known to Stiefel as Konrad Fischer, and Stiefel loved to share his trove with his Nazi and Nazi-adjacent friends who, in turn, wanted to show it to their friends. That's how word eventually reached Gerd Heidemann, a big-deal investigative reporter for Stern, and a man who was, not so secretly, an admirer of all things Nazi. He was such a fan, in fact, that he had recently purchased the Karen II, the luxury yacht once owned by Nazi Air Marshal Hermann Göring, a boat he had named after his first wife, who had tragically died. The purchase had put journalist Heidemann in deep debt, some of that owed to his employer, who had advanced him almost a year's salary to help him buy the boat. Once he owned the boat, he entertained former Nazis and the small world of serious collectors of their relics. But maintaining a 40-year-old Nazi yacht turned out to be expensive, and after finally getting his hands on it, Gerd Heidemann began looking like a man who might be ready to unload it. Word got out. People talked. The like-minded exchanged numbers. Soon enough, Fritz Stiefel contacted Heidemann and invited him to gape at his secret stash of Nazi paraphernalia and all that Hitler art, poetry, and doodadniks, all with authentication. Included was a tantalizing excerpt from a heretofore unknown Hitler diary. Maybe they could work a trade. Maybe they could exchange intel about who might be in the market for such Hitler-touched things as leaky boats and bad poetry. Heidemann was floored. The collection was impressive, but the diary page, that was the gold. It wasn't just a scoop, it was a career maker. Heidemann knew the value of a great story. He was, after all, the first journalist to track down and interview Klaus Barbie, the so-called Butcher of Leon, while Barbie was still in hiding. But this was something else entirely. The private thoughts of Adolf Hitler. What if there were more? What if he could read them? What if, better still, he could own a few himself? First, he would have to convince Stiefel to give up the identity of his mysterious supplier, still known only as Konrad Fischer, and persuade that supplier to share where he had found the diaries and where Heidemann might get more. When Kujau/Fischer was asked by Stiefel to help out his friend, Kujau balked. For more than a year, he dodged the reporter. Maybe it felt too risky. Maybe he was deciding what to do next. Heidemann was not a reporter for nothing. Hearing crickets from Stiefel's source, he decided to check out the circumstances of the airplane crash, which was said to be the mother lode of Hitler's most private stuff. He went to the site of the crash, a small town named Bernersdorfer near Dresden, and heard the long-told tales of how the locals had braved the flames, absconded with the boxes, hid them in barns for 40 years, and, given the paucity of opportunity in East Germany in the late 1970s, were now offering them for sale. Heidemann went back to Stiefel, who had added in another middleman to help reel in Kujau. Heidemann made an offer, the equivalent of $400,000 for the rest of the diaries, however many there were. The total was vague, but the excitement sure wasn't. Kujau, who had once even tried to buy back the original diary page from Stifel, now saw the con growing into something bigger than he'd imagined. This wasn't small-time fakery anymore. This was real money. And soon, what was originally said to be 6 diaries up for discussion grew to be 27. Naturally, the price climbed too. Manfred Fischer, obviously no relation to the alias adopted by Kujau, was the managing director of Gruner & Jahr, the parent company of Stern. Heidemann had pitched the project as a once-in-a-lifetime journalistic and commercial opportunity. Serialize the diaries in Stern, syndicate the rights internationally, and bask in prestige and profit. Fischer agreed. The $400,000 Heidemann offered was Gruner & Jahr's money. The buyers-to-be then told the seller that he didn't even have to give up ownership. All the buyers wanted was the right to photocopy the material and publish it. Everyone at the table thought they were playing each other for advantage. Kujau thought he would make hay while the sun shone. In one pre-sale exchange, and in apparent show of good faith, Heidemann gifted Kujau/Fischer what handwriting expert Charles Hamilton later described as, quote, a collector's item of extraordinary rarity and value that would make his uniform collection of Third Reich leaders the finest in the world, end quote. In return, Kujau/Fischer gifted Heidemann with a rare oil painting, supposedly by Adolf Hitler. Small aside, both were fakes. Anyway, the burst of mutual admiration served as an open invitation to Kujau to start making diaries. So anxious were the buyers and their representatives to seal the deal that they wrote in a letter to the still unknown to them dealer that, quote, should you prefer gold to currency, there would be an unlimited amount, end quote. All Kujau had to do now was produce the diaries. To create the Hitler journals, Konrad Kujau sat down to fine-tune the Führer's penmanship and his Gothic German vocabulary. He knew he needed to have multiple reference materials that solidly chronicled the day-to-day placements and actions of Hitler. He had a lot of that already, being in the relic business, but he needed to comb his Rolodex for those ex-Nazis who had personally interacted with Hitler and had stories to tell. The diary bit that was in Stifel's possession had been a one-off kind of dalliance for Kujau, a quick forgery he had dashed off using a magazine memoir as inspiration. No one with real authority had ever been asked to authenticate it. Stifel and Kujau worked on a kind of blind trust. Stern, for the record, should have known better, but it made no initial effort to determine the validity of what it was being offered at, it should be noted, a mighty steep price. Per the agreement, Kujau was required to come up with 2 or 3 full diaries every month. Proving most helpful to him was Max Domarus's 2-volume work, Hitler's Speeches and Proclamations, and Die Bild Zeitung, a right-wing tabloid known for its appetite for sensational WW2 stories. These sources helped Kujau mirror the tone and chronology of Hitler's daily life without having to invent every detail himself. And as for the production quality, he didn't overthink it. According to one source, he spent another month practicing Hitler's handwriting and took an old notebook from a genuine SS document, affixed it to the cover using a German army wax seal, and then he aged the book by applying tea to the pages and beating the hell out of it. You know, to make it all look authentic. The first delivery consisted of 3 diaries handed over to Heidemann on February 17, 1981. The next day, Heidemann delivered the books to Manfred Fischer of the Stern publisher's office. The first payout was 85,000 marks, with the agreed-upon sum of 2.2 million marks due after 27 diaries had been delivered. The scheme was too delicious. The number of diaries eventually created and sold to Stern would swell to 62. Kujau worked hard, but got sloppy. He began using dime store notebooks, Pelican ink bought off the shelf, plastic embellishments glued to the covers, and Nazi ribbons recycled from minor documents. No matter. The few in the know at Stern were too busy drooling over their supposed scoop to even notice. Later, when the diaries first became public, Stern got the reaction they wanted as the BBC's first reports were decidedly enthusiastic.
If the documents are genuine, and there's a considerable body of authoritative opinion that says they are undoubtedly the most important discovery of their kind to have come to light since the events they appear to cover. It is a fact that shortly before Hitler committed suicide in the Berlin bunker in 1945, he packed his personal documents into tin trunks and tried to have them flown out to Bavaria. The aircraft was shot down over what is now East Germany. The 9 people on board died. Hitler is on record as mourning the loss of his documents. The documents that have now come to light. At the moment, they're in a Swiss bank vault.
Stern's editors were delighted by the obvious wisdom of their investment. They were also very, very stupid. Just how stupid? Well, for starters, they had already recently been burned when they had published Hitler's supposed poems. In 1979, Eberhard Jäckel, a University of Stuttgart professor with exquisite credentials as a Third Reich historian, had a look at Steifel's collection to assess its worth. Terrifically impressed by the sheer abundance of the loot, oddly verified everything in it. That meant he had given his imprimatur to the Hitler poetry bits that Kujau had written. Jäckel had even included them in a scholarly volume of Hitler's earliest writings. Shortly after that publication, a Munich archivist recognized one of the poems as having been written during World War I by Nazi poet Heribert Menzel. Horribly embarrassed, Jäckel was required to stipulate that some of the poetry attributed to Hitler, a young German army corporal at the time of the supposed writing, was bogus. Later, he turned over all 76 Hitler-signed poems to the Hamburg district attorney as evidence of fraud. So, yes, Stern editors already knew the newfound diaries were coming from the same mysterious supplier behind the fake poetry. They didn't know his name, but they knew the cover story. A West German middleman buying artifacts from East German peasants who had looted the wreckage of a Nazi plane in 1945. Records show that red flags, at some point, went up at Stern, but came down just as quickly. The management at Stern would later say they were trying to keep a lid on their big scoop. They said they wanted to limit the number of people who knew the diaries even existed. They worried about letting any competition know for fear of a bidding war. They even gave the project a cloak and dagger code name, Operation Green Vault. That meant, they would later say, that they regrettably asked very few questions. Indeed, Stern had ample opportunity to talk to those who had worked alongside Hitler for years. Secretaries, adjutants, and bodyguards who had survived the war were still alive and could have easily authenticated his handwriting or turn of phrase. Most knew that he wrote little, typically dictating his rantings and speeches for someone else to write down. And he was not known to have been particularly introspective. In fact, Mein Kampf, his infamous political treatise, was not something he had slavishly typed out in 1923 while serving time for staging an attempted coup. He dictated it to his chauffeur, Emil Maurice, and to his early deputy, Rudolf Hess. So yeah, the whole private diary angle should have raised more than a few eyebrows. And yet, few people flinched. The journals were on a fast track to publication. They made a pit stop to be translated into modern German, but by now, Kujau was producing one diary a week. Now there's a saying about there being honor among thieves. In this case, not so much. Heidemann was, in fact, charging Stern more than he was telling or sharing with Kujau. In the end, there would be an accounting of the money and, depending on whom you ask, somewhere between 1 and 5 million in Deutschmarks was missing. It was assumed to have gone to Heidemann. Kujau seemed unfazed. He figured that when the boom fell, and he seemed pretty sure it would land on Heidemann for being so ridiculously gullible. That may explain why Kujau began to kind of wing it going rogue on some topics while ignoring others altogether. Maybe he understood marketability or popular taste. For instance, he had Hitler mention that Eva Braun got a puppy, but conveniently left out major history-defining battles. Priorities. Still, there were a few revelations that headlined the importance of the diaries and upped their value. First, Kujau wrote that Hitler despised some of his closest advisors, people like Joseph Goebbels, his chief propagandist. Second, he claimed that Hitler had personally approved Rudolf Hess's bizarre 1941 solo flight to Scotland in a failed attempt to negotiate peace with Britain. Third, Kujau painted Hitler as a reluctant warmonger forced into conflict by aggressive generals. And, most implausibly, that Hitler had been blissfully unaware of the Holocaust. Maybe, with the price of the diaries having reached so high, Kujau wanted Stern to get its money's worth. As the diaries kept appearing and Stern kept paying, they were in for about 4 million Deutschmarks by the end of 1982, the magazine decided to offset their expense by selling publishing rights to some big hitters worldwide. To shore up their pitch, they engaged 2 experts to cover the question, are they real? Hamilton, himself an expert, wrote in the Hitler Diaries that neither of the 2 experts chosen by Stern to do the verifying were familiar with Hitler's script, nor could they read German. A few days later, potential co-publishing partners were lured to the Swiss bank vault, which held the 2-foot-high stack of diaries, as well as all of Stifel's collected crap, his battle flags and paintings and swastika banners and weapons and badges and extraneous Nazi glitter. For the most part, the spectacle did its job. Media magnate Rupert Murdoch knew this was a surefire moneymaker and circulation booster. The BBC's Harris said Murdoch saw the commercial potential in it, above all else. Murdoch probably wanted to serialize it and make a movie about it. Now that's all true, but before he waded in too deep, Murdoch wanted some assurance that he was getting what he was going to pay for. He sent Hugh Trevor Roper, an English lord and renowned expert on the Third Reich, to be his eyes that day in the bank vault. And Trevor Roper was dazzled. Peter Koch, the editor of Stern, was on hand to add more luster to his pitch to the Murdoch associate, telling him that he personally knew the Wehrmacht officer who pulled the zinc crates from the Inferno that day in April 1945. I think the technical term for that is pants on fire. Trevor Roper was also explicitly assured that German experts had already authenticated both the handwriting and the paper stock. The Englishman wanted some time to think about all this, but Murdoch demanded a decision. The time to ponder wilted under such pressure. Trevor Roper gave it his very important blessing. On April 9, 1983, Murdoch offered $2.5 million for American serial rights and an additional $750,000 for British and Australian rights. That's $3.25 million. That deal would have been worth about $10 million today if you're going by boring inflation math, but by Murdoch's math, the kind that multiplies across headlines, books, films, and global syndication, it was like placing a $1 billion bet. Newsweek followed with a lowball offer, but quickly upped it to $3 million, contingent on authenticating the materials. The authority they tapped was Gerhard Weinberg, a highly respected historian at the University of North Carolina. Weinberg was extremely cautious. He gave Newsweek an itemized list of reasons the diaries could be fake. But maybe, he hedged, just maybe, they weren't. The people at Stern now took the opportunity to get greedy. After already having shaken a few hands on the deal, they thought they'd up the stakes, playing each of the bidders against each other. That was a spectacular mistake. Murdoch and Newsweek walked. Newsweek would later say they suspected fraud. Murdoch just wasn't going to be played. In the end, the numbers fell. Murdoch paid $1.2 million for American, British, and Australian rights, Paris Match paid $400,000, and other lesser literary lights paid about $250,000 more combined. When the Times of London published their first installment on Saturday, April 23, 1983, it was accompanied by a piece by Trevor Roper that said it was genuine goods. Big mistake. Huge. As I mentioned earlier, the day before the first installment of the Hitler Diaries was set to run, on that Friday, a Newsweek reporter approached Charles Hamilton with copies of the diary in hand. Hamilton had decades of reading Hitler's words in the original scrawl. He gave the pages a few seconds of his time and said, "That's not Hitler's handwriting." The bright light of media scrutiny fell on a bevy of fresh experts. Some, like Hamilton, were adamant in their verdicts. Others waffled. Those who had previously staked their reputations on the veracity of the diaries backtracked. Maybe some of the entries were real, but others weren't. More people weighed in. Remaining Hitler associates told a United Press International reporter that the words just, quote, didn't ring true, end quote. A former KGB agent who was a college professor said the diaries appeared to be fakes, likely produced by the Soviet to soften Hitler's image. That, he said, would make it look like Hitler was anxious to stop the war while the Allies wanted to prolong it. The goal, he said, would be to, quote, discredit the American and British moves in World War II, end quote. The Soviets claimed it was a CIA plot to glorify the Third Reich. Journalists at the Sunday Times blamed the old SS networks still loyal to their dead Fuhrer. No one was without a conspiracy theory. Meanwhile, neo-Nazis around the world rejoiced. Stern editor Peter Koch stood defiant. The magazine's London editor, Peter Wickman, told the BBC that, quote, we were very dubious at the beginning, but we had graphologists looking at them. We had experts who compared the paper. We had historians like Trevor Roper, who were all convinced they are genuine, end quote. Charles Douglas Hume, editor of the Times newspaper, followed suit. Hume said it wasn't just the diaries, it was the fact that there were 300 of his drawings and pictures and personal documents and his party card and the helmet. All of these things combined convinced people like Trevor Roper, Hume said. Quote, now a forger would have to be very good to forge across that whole range, end quote. Famous last words. On May 6th, authorities at West Germany's Federal Archives labeled the diaries as, quote, grotesquely superficial forgeries, end quote. The documents had not passed tests for authentic age or for association with Hitler. Glue used to affix seals and ribbons to the text contained elements not available in 1945. The supposedly weathered pages had been stained with tea. The official government report went on and on. The publisher of Stern, scrambling, appeared on German TV to say that the Federal Archives is not God Almighty. But it was over. Soon enough, the publication of the diaries ceased, and people began to look for the guy behind the scam. Their first stop was Gerd Heidemann, who swore up and down to his bosses and to authorities that he had been acting in good faith. On May 14, 1983, Konrad Kujau, age 44, surrendered to police at a Bavarian border post. He was being held on charges of fraud when, 2 weeks later, he implicated Heidemann as knowing all along that the diaries were not real. In his own confession, Kujau had kept his sense of humor, signing it, quote, yours truly, Adolf Hitler, alias Konrad Kujau, end quote. According to the Washington Post, neighbors in the village of Bissingen recalled Kujau grumbling about working day and night on a book about Hitler for Stern magazine. Koch and fellow editor Felix Schmidt resigned, albeit with nice golden parachutes, and 200 Stern journalists staged a sit-in to denounce the magazine's lack of consultation with its own reporters and criticizing what they saw as a growing anti-American slant in its editorial leadership. Ultimately, the West German court had their say on July 8, 1985. Judge Hans Ulrich Schrader said, quote, Stern acted with such naivety and negligence that it was virtually an accomplice in the fraud, end quote. Schrader then said he was convinced that Heidemann had embezzled the missing money, but he had no proof of that. Alas. All he could do was sentence Heidemann to 4 years, 8 months in prison. Kujau got 4 years, 6 months. Kujau's common-law wife, Edith Lieblong, got 8 months of probation for helping Konrad in his efforts. Stern's circulation tanked, as did its ad sales. An early 90s estimate of the magazine's loss due to the forgeries was about 19 million marks, but it recovered. In the early 2000s, the magazine was selling about 1 million copies a week. It's still in business, though with a reduced circulation of about 300,000 per 2023 numbers. And now, as I said at the start of the episode, let's talk about the broader damage of the Hitler Diary hoax, the kind not measured in lost revenue, but in public trust. More specifically, what exactly was the fallout when extremely well-respected purveyors of truth willingly, or just stupidly, tainted the truth for gain? The BBC's Harris said, quote, "I do think it did damage to journalists and to the reputation of the whole industry of journalism. And, in a sense, you can trace the beginning of a certain pollution of truth and mass communication, that it wasn't going to be truth and you had to be more skeptical." He added that we live in a trashier age, a much more dumbed-down age, and the Hitler Diaries were a sort of staging post on the way to that. Maybe it was ever thus. Sophocles once famously said, "What people believe prevails over the truth." Now, when we can debunk conspiracies with hard facts and solid science, there are plenty who do not accept the proof. Journalists are now hard-pressed to establish truth because the willingness to believe lies grew glamorous. And that, in itself, is a monstrous crime.